Each term I find my students commenting on their struggle to keep up with and to get on top of all the reading being asked of them. I've always been struck by the fact that in fact none of my students has ever been taught how to read and how to cope with all of the reading that they're being asked to do in practical ways. It's always just assumed that people will learn by doing, either sinking or swimming as they struggle. This seems to me to be particularly harsh for students who, in my case, are speaking English as a second or third language, or for students with various visual or cognitive disadvantages that make reading particularly or differently challenging. Well, this short guide to more effective and efficient academic reading is my basic attempt to address these kinds of challenges and problems. It's something that I started developing while working at the University of Washington in the United States of America, initially on the Seattle campus, but eventually on the Bothell campus, where faculty and staff were especially committed to good pedagogy. There are a number of common challenges everyone has to deal with when doing academic reading, whether you're a fresher, a senior, a graduate student, or a professor. Perhaps the most common of these challenges have to do with speed, retention, and endurance. In other words, how to move quickly through lots of material, manage to remember all of it, and somehow stay on top of the rest of your work at the same time. Well, the fact is that academic reading does get easier the more you do it, although at each stage of your academic career, the amount of reading and the complexity just seems to keep scaling up. The challenges of speed, retention, and endurance are made all the worse by a number of additional obstacles and challenges that are quite particular to academic reading. First, there's the need to understand all that specialist language, technical terms, lay terms which have technical meanings, and the use of Latin, German, or French words are just a few examples of how specialist the language becomes. Dealing with academic register, that very particular fancy, elaborate, or very dense way that academics are often obliged to or encouraged to write. Identifying the most important information is a particular challenge always, identifying key concepts and finding the main argument or the thesis of a paper or an essay. And by the same token, once you've found that argument or thesis, finding the best reading path which enables you to stay on track with the main argument, not getting sidetracked on or with less relevant information or material. Well, what follows in this guide are some basic tips for processing or handling academic readings effectively, in other words, helping with retention, and also efficiently, helping with speed and endurance. Very quickly, and before I go further, it's worth just thinking about the types of reading that you're likely to come across. Very basically speaking, there are three main types of books. As an undergraduate student, you're most likely going to come across textbooks in some of your courses. These are neatly organized, summarized, and accessibly digested introductions to fields or theoretical domains. As you become more advanced, you're more likely to meet edited volumes or anthologies, where each chapter is written by someone different. And then, of course, there are monographs where the whole book is written by the same person or by different people or the same people. In my guide here, I'm going to use the model of an academic journal article, which is very common in my field and in many social sciences or humanistic social sciences. The basic principles nonetheless apply to most types of academic reading. These are the kinds of readings that you're likely to come across. Journal articles, as I say, which will be the default one I'll be looking at here. Book chapters, either from monographs or edited volumes. conference papers, online essays, and so on. Most of the time you're going to be asked to read individual chapters, but sometimes you may indeed be asked to read entire books. Well, even if you are supposed to read a whole book, the point is that you may simply have to cut corners. And this, in this guide, is what cutting corners looks like. The worst possible thing to do when taking on an academic reading is to start with the first word of the first line of the first paragraph of the first page and then take it from there. Word by word by word, page by page by page, blow by painful blow. I urge you to resist this impulse, to take a pause, step back, and start by trying to see the forest before you see the trees. One interesting speed reading technique sometimes recommended is to trace a backwards Z or Z across each page of the piece you are about to read. Use the back of your pen or your finger, not too fast and not too slow, about 4 seconds per page. And tracing backwards helps to slow you down just enough as well. And the idea is not to read things as such, but just to notice anything that sticks out. It may be a word, a heading, or just the look of each page. And this might feel like a slightly absurd exercise, but what you'll already end up with is a sense of the general layout or the architecture of the paper. Are there images, graphs, tables of statistics, etc.? Can you spot an introduction and conclusion clearly labeled? What about other things that stand out? The idea behind this little exercise is to demythologize the paper. Rather than wading in terrified, at least now you have a general lay of the land. You know that there's an end in sight, and you know roughly when that's going to come and what it's going to look like. Let me show you what this would look like or feel like in practice. For convenience, I'm going to use this example of an article by Deborah Cameron, who's a British sociolinguist working at Oxford University. Professor Cameron happens to be an excellent writer, someone very smart who also has the gift of writing accessibly. Her papers are always nicely signposted and systematically organized around a clearly articulated thesis. Sadly, it has to be said, not all papers are quite so well written, including my own. So here goes. Imagine that the dotted line is my pen or finger tracing the backwards Z across the page. You trace the line counting aloud or in your head from 1 to 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Already you'll have spotted the title, the abstract, perhaps even the keywords, and the clearly marked introduction. Now for the second page. 1, 2, 3, 4. You may not pick up anything else other than the odd random word here and there, and that's totally fine. Just keep going. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. It's possible at the end of these 2 pages that it's just the heading that you've picked out, and that itself is not a bad place to start. Again, keep going. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Notice here, for example, that what we've spotted is a subheader, something that looks like a few quotes, and a clearly labeled conclusion. That's always a really good sign, as you're going to see in just a moment. And remember again that the point of this little exercise, and do try to commit to it and see it right through to the end, is simply to start mapping the architecture of the paper, its layout and its organization. At the very least, as I say, you'll have a sense of how long the paper is before you start reading, and this may or may not make you feel better. Well, with this easy bit out of the way, it's time to start engaging a little more deeply with the paper. In other words, to start mapping the architecture in more detail and getting a better sense of the paper's narrative. They may not be as exciting as Hollywood blockbusters or best-selling novels, but academic papers, chapters and articles are just stories of one kind or another. So before you start moving through the paper in earnest, your first task is to locate the key concepts and the main argument. And the main argument is what we often refer to as the thesis. To this end, what I strongly recommend is that you flick your way back through the paper to see if you can locate headings, subheadings, and all kinds of information that's marked in bold and italics, to see where the authors define, explain, or discuss the key concepts and the main argument themselves in more detail. In fact, my advice is to take a moment and take a blank piece of paper and transcribe all the headings and subheadings into this blank piece of paper. Or you could type it up as well. And this should be the first thing you do in the way of note-taking. Literally write out or type out each one after the other, and trying to recreate a sense of the hierarchy. In other words, headings, subheadings, and sub-subheadings, which may be in capitals, lowercase and italics, or just indented in different ways. Take a look here at our example paper by Deborah Cameron. This is what it looks like when I strip out everything from Professor Cameron's paper except for the headings and the subheadings. It's actually a very straightforward paper with an introduction, data section, and conclusion. You can also see that there's a theory moment, style, styling, stylization, where some key terms or concepts are being explained. Then there's the body of the paper, i.e. call center style and woman's language, and an argument section after the data is also presented, the one that starts revaluing woman's language. Notice, by the way, the quote marks around woman's language and expressive. Typically, although not always, if authors are introducing a new term, a special term, or a problematic term, they'll write the word in italics or they'll scare quote it. If there's a citation afterwards, then it's someone else's great idea or bad idea. If not, then it's something the author feels really pleased with or really concerned about. I recommend that you keep an eye out for these kinds of typographical clues. Anyway, what you're left with here is a really useful outline of the general organization of the paper and its narrative thread. These are the key milestones along the way. You may not understand everything, in fact you may understand very little, but it's all laid out here before you. And of course this is what headings are all supposed to do. They're supposed to capture the most important point in each section. And it's now, and only now, that I think you're ready to start reading the paper for real. This is where you'll really need to start reading the paper and mining it for the right stuff. Well, my guide here derives some cheesy, slightly tongue-in-cheek inspiration from The Sound of Music. Not because it's set in Switzerland, because it's not, but because of Maria's noble attempt to teach the Von Trapp children the basic notes of the musical scale. She reliably informs them, when you read you begin with the A, B, C, and when you sing you begin with Do, Re, Mi. Well, in this kind of style I'm proposing 6 basic steps for ordering your reading efficiently and effectively. This 6-step model is based on the processing of a journal article, as I say. And these are the 6 areas of the paper or parts of the paper that you should cover and the order in which you should cover them. Make sure you've done this before you read for any more detail. If you do not have time to go deeper into the reading, here's where you go first, and this is the order in which you do it. You'd be surprised how often people dive into a paper without paying any attention at all to the title. Always make sure you've unpacked the title a little before proceeding. Break it apart and pinpoint what seem to be the main components. A good title, and there are always bad ones, will include the author's thesis, their main argument, as well as their key terms or concepts. Almost all journal articles have an abstract, which is a summary of the whole article. And for academics, this is often the hardest thing to write, because this is where they have to summarize 7,000 or 8,000 words into just 100 to 300 words. And so what it actually means for you, however, is that they've done all the hard work already. A good abstract, and there are bad ones, will include the following information. It will include the problem or the issue, why the study was done in the first place, new or key concepts, the special new ideas, the method and the procedure, what the author did to prove their point, and the main findings or interpretations, in other words, what they discovered, and then finally the conclusion, the big moment which tells you what their thesis or argument is and what their contribution to the field is. Let's have a look again at the paper by Deborah Cameron. And we'll look at the title to start with. It's very common for titles to come in two parts like this one. More often than not, the first part, in this case, Styling the Worker, offers a clever, poetic or witty summing up of the thesis or the main argument. Sometimes authors use a quote from a participant to exemplify the issues. And then the second part of the title, if it's a two-part title like this one, usually is just a fairly straightforward description of what the study does or looks at in very practical terms. And this one here, as you can see, looks at three things: gender, commodification of language, and the globalized service economy. And of course you may not understand these terms, although gender is pretty obvious, but you need to understand them before you finish the paper. So this is what I recommend you write down, again, on that very early set of notes that you've begun to take. So, like many journal articles, there are often also key words. Styling, commodification of language, and globalized service economy, that you write down on the piece of paper, and you make sure that by the time you've finished working with the reading, you've understood what these are, because the author herself has told you these are the single most important notions or concepts or ideas that my paper is about. Of course, as I just started to indicate, at the end of this abstract here we find keywords listed, and this happens often in books and articles. And again, this is a very digested summary of the main ideas covered in a paper. And the same kind of unpacking exercise needs also to be done with the abstract itself. So reading through the abstract, you need to just do your best, even if none of it makes sense. Make as much sense of it as you can. At the end of the day, the main thing is to write these key bits of information down. And so what we're often able to do with a very good abstract, one that is written really effectively and clearly, is to identify what the paper is all about, in this case sociolinguistic characteristics of the speech style. We also learn what Professor Cameron did. She looked at linguistic and vocal styling, where she did it, call centres in Britain. We also learn what she looked at or what she analysed, similarities between worker style and so-called women's language. And finally, we also learn from the abstract what it is that Professor Cameron drew in the way of a conclusion from all of this, the intensive regulation of service workers' speech, etc. Unpacking an abstract like this is rather like drawing up a shopping list before going shopping. If you don't make the list, you go into the store wondering why you came in, forgetting the milk, and buying a whole load of candy that you didn't even know you wanted in the first place. Taking time to unpack the abstract before you start reading helps to prepare yourself before the reading and tells you what you should be looking for as you go forwards. Speaking of which, now you are finally ready to start reading the paper. And this is where you start. I hesitate to use a PowerPoint bounce effect like this because they're incredibly tacky, but I really do want to get your attention, and so I'm going to do it again. This is the first thing you should do when tackling any kind of academic paper. You go to the end of the paper first. After the title and the abstract, or the keywords, jump to the conclusion, not the introduction. Whatever Maria von Trapp tells us, starting at the very beginning is actually not always a very good place to start. When it comes to academic reading, A, B, C and Do, Re, Mi actually don't make a lot of sense. A good conclusion, and there are bad ones, is basically just another summary of the article, only this time it should be a bit less condensed. This is the author's last chance to tell us what's so special about their paper. In other words, what new information or findings in a thesis they are contributing to the field. Remember how I said that spotting Professor Cameron's clearly labelled conclusion was a good sign when we did the backwards Z game? And here's why. This is precisely where you should head next. And when you know that there's a clearly marked conclusion, you're off to a good start. Be rest assured the conclusion still may not make much sense to you. You haven't really read the paper yet, remember, but give it a chance. Give yourself a break too. Just try to see what's there and if you can make some sense of what's being said. Look out for sentences which begin with words like "I argue that," because this is usually a good sign that you found the author's argument. And only then do you head back to the introduction. Now it's time to bring things home. The introduction is where the author or the authors need to set out the problem or the issues as they see it, explaining why she felt the need to write the paper or to conduct the study in the first place. What's the social problem or the theoretical issue that prompted her to conduct the study or write the essay in the first place? And in the introduction, of course, authors always need to give a literature review, a summary, or maybe short or long, of the existing literature, previous articles, papers, chapters and books which relate to their study. Toward the end of the introduction, you may also find research questions. All studies or papers start with some kind of question or questions which the writer wants to answer, and this is the core motivation for the study or the paper or the essay. And it's important to locate these questions or this question before you go too far. Sometimes authors identify their research questions very clearly, especially in social scientific papers, labeling them research questions. Other times you may have to look a little bit more carefully or deeply for the clues, literally looking for things like question marks. And sometimes there's only one question, other times there are two or more related questions. Finally, and depending on how much time you have, work through the major examples or data that the authors use. These are chosen as proof of the thesis or the argument that they're trying to make, and as ways to clarify the key concepts. And so they'll give you an even better understanding of what the article is about. And if you're required to have more detail, now would be a good time to look a little bit more carefully at the procedures or the method used in the study. And sometimes we need to know what exactly a researcher did so that we can judge their findings or their interpretations for ourselves. But, and I'm willing to go on record with this, if you are pushed for time, the examples and the data are the last things you should spend time on. It's essential that you understand the argument or the thesis of the paper first and foremost. So just a few words to wrap up. As a rule of thumb, if you're very pressed for time, you can always get an immediate impression of the article or the paper or the chapter from just the title and, if there is one, the abstract or the keywords. After that, the more of the 6 steps you're able to accomplish, the deeper your understanding will be. As I say, these basic tips apply to all academic reading, even if it's not a journal article. If it's a book chapter, for example, you probably won't have an abstract, in which case the title's a starting point. And there's almost always headings and subheadings of one kind or another, and then you go directly to the conclusion. At the end of the day, very few of us, professors, graduate students and undergraduate students alike, have time to read everything that we might like to read or that we're supposed to read. Remember also, as you grapple with the fearsome article your professor's just given you to read, that she's probably read it 3 or 4 times herself before she really came to know and understand it. And that's what we call real dedication. In the meantime, however, I wish you success with finding the right stuff for yourself.